So, as we've done each week, I'm going to tell you a life of missionary, a story, and then at the end, I want you to tell me what stand out to you in their life. Are there any Bible passages that come to mind as you think about their life for a couple moments, and then we'll move into our prayer time. All right, so the two men we've considered so far, Henry Martyn, David Brainerd, were missionaries before America was even born. Raymond Llull, however, was a missionary before America was even discovered. Raymond Llull, it's the strangest spelling I've ever seen. I had to quadruple check it. It's Llull. While he did journal many of his missionary travels, he did not journal them with a pencil. That's mostly because the pencil was not invented for 300 years after he lived. When Raymond Llull was born, Genghis Khan recently died. Thomas Aquinas was just 7 years old, and Marco Polo wouldn't be born for 2 more decades. Raymond Llull was a missionary in an era in which there are virtually no known missionaries. He lived in what we call the Middle or Dark Ages, and against all odds, it was in this what some consider very primitive time that he was an incredibly innovative missionary. Now, because of when he lived, you can imagine there's not as many journals and writings that exist. So what we have here are based on some of his writings, some other writings that we have, but admittedly, some of the stories, like a lot of older church history, distinguishing like fact from legend, right? So maybe some of this should be taken with a grain of salt. I don't know, just because of its age and where it comes from. But I tried to fact check. It's funny. I did actually look up Wikipedia for this one just to look at what I wrote. And everything I had written was essentially there in some form or fashion. So I don't think this is too far out there. Raymond Llull was born in Majorca. Anybody know where Majorca is? Spain. Yes, coast of Spain. So a very small speck of an island off the coast of Spain. Raymond Llull was born in the year 1232. 1232. He was born into a lavishly rich family, and his father wound up making his money through, I don't exactly understand how, but through various campaigns and wars that had happened of them fighting off the invading Moors. If you know who the Moors are, basically African Muslims that were trying to take over parts of Spain and Portugal. And as a result, the Spanish king granted Raymond Llull's family a very large estate because of what his father had done. And so he grew up with privilege and riches and lots of wealth. So he grew up very well-to-do. He attended some of the best schools in Spain and wound up going to school with literal princes, if you want to put it that way. Though he grew up with royalty and civility, Raymond Llull, though, when he was younger, a young man, had a taste for all things sensuous and forbidden. It is said that with his wealth and status, it made him a very popular young man and well-liked, especially by women. Llull reveled and lived for it and lived in constant immorality. In fact, some of the earliest writings that we have of his, which we do have actually quite a few writings of his, are actually, I don't know how else to put this, but like the Dark Ages equivalent of like seedy paperback romance novels. You know, I don't know how else to describe that, right? But like very like graphic and sensual poems and writings that he did from this period and time of his life. But the more he relished in his sexual exploits, the more miserable he ultimately became, and would later talk about how ashamed he was of how he had lived during this time. So at the age of 30, Llull described something incredible that happened. Now, this is one of those things. Look, I'm just going to tell you what the story says. I'm not going to sit here and explain or defend it. I'm just going to tell you the story, okay? The point of this tonight is to hear the story. Okay. At the age of 30, Lowell said that he was at his home in Spain one evening when something dramatic happened. He was composing a torrid love poem to a married woman that he was having an affair with. And Lowell said that while lying in bed, he saw, quote, a vision of the crucified Christ. And Lowell was overwhelmed by what he saw. And he sensed that Christ was rebuking him for his sin and his unrepentant lifestyle. He said the vision appeared to him 5 times over the next week, and he experienced a deep sense of remorse and said that he finally repented of his sins and came to faith in Jesus. And so from that day forward in 1263, he gave his life to Christ and turned from his sensual way. I don't know what to do with that. All right, medieval visions, right? But the guy became a Christian, so praise God. It's all right. So Lowell looked around, and what he saw within Christianity that time deeply disturbed him. This is so interesting to think that this. The church was in the middle. The church was in the middle of the Fourth Crusade. If you're familiar with the Crusades. Think of it as sort of quasi-ecclesiastical and military efforts to recapture the Holy Land from Muslim jihadists and so forth. And so Lowell, as this was going on, he saw what was coming from the Crusades, and he resolved that something should be done about this because he found that the Crusades were backfiring. Of the Crusades, in one of his journals, Raymond Llull wrote, quote, I see many knights going to the Holy Land thinking that they can acquire it by force. But it seems to me that the conquest of the Muslim ought to be attempted by love and prayer and by the pouring out of tears on their behalf instead of blood. And so instead of soldiers, Lowell wanted to see missionaries sent to reach people. He was considered, I don't know what people would say, like, I don't know, progressive liberal for the day, because he wasn't on the side of let's go fight and take in war, right? And he was talking very passively about just loving and sharing the gospel and doing these kinds of things. But nevertheless, this passion that he had stayed with him. And so he began working day and night to gain support, to send others as missionaries to go to the Holy Land to reach the Muslims. And he even is recorded in one of his journals as encouraging the church to give 10% of its annual revenues to give to send missionaries, which is like the cooperative program in the 1200s. It's just, okay. But of course, virtually nobody listened to him. And so he decided that he was going to do something about it himself. And if nobody else would go and others wouldn't be sent, then he himself would go. So he committed, instead of going to the Holy Land, though, he thought that he would go directly into what he called the lion's den of Islam. And he set his sights on traveling to the shores of North Africa. And so, while he was preparing for this, he started reading about and was inspired by a Christian that he had recently read about, who had just recently died, an Italian monk by the name of St. Francis of Assisi. Wow. Right? Isn't this crazy? We were talking about how he heard Charles Wesley preach, and he had been reading about St. Francis, who had only died like a decade earlier, and he saw St. Francis's commitment to simplicity in living and being on mission, and so Lowell decided to sell all of his worldly goods, to give everything that he had. If the churches wouldn't give him money, he would sponsor himself, and sold everything so that he could travel to North Africa to begin this work. However, he did not go as quickly as he thought. He felt that even though he had been schooled and taught in some of the best schools in Spain, that he needed to learn a lot more. And so, in preparing to go to North Africa, he spent the next 26 years studying, reading, writing, learning. He read everything that he could by the Mohammedans. He spent time learning Arabic, learning philosophy, learning everything that he possibly could so that he would be equipped to go to the field. So remember Brainerd and Martin, they got saved and they went straight to the mission field, right? This guy took 26 years to prepare to go. Well, during this time, this is what's so fascinating about him. During this time, he developed this insatiable appetite for really anything he could learn. And so he started writing, and Lowell wrote at least 265 known works. I don't mean all books, but 265 known works. And they range from everything to botany, alchemy, mathematics, astronomy, science, literature, and religion. During the time, he is credited to this day with having discovered what today we know of as ether. In addition, he is cited as, I'm not making this up, as the inventor of modern computation theory and several advanced mathematical theorems. And his mathematics and logic that he wrote about during this time is considered the foundation upon which modern computer science has been built. If you go to Wikipedia, most of the article is not about him as an apologist and a missionary, but his mathematical and philosophical works that he wrote during this time. But Lull's deep passion was for apologetics and Christian study. And so Lull decided that he would learn theology and religion. And so he began studying everything he could about Muslim belief and what was being taught. Again, various philosophies. He learned Greek and Hebrew and Latin and French and Aramaic. I mean, he had 26 years, right? Surely he could learn one more in there. He studied Muslim doctrine and philosophy so that he would learn how to debate them when the time came. What was so interesting about Raymond Llull, and I at the very end I'll explain how this was confirmed to me in an unexpected way. His approach to unbelievers, and especially people of other faiths, was incredibly different if you imagine the time of the Crusades. He was courteous and respectful of people that disagreed with him. He gladly acknowledged what degree of truth he could find in their view as being consistent with what God had revealed. For Lowell, he felt that these common ground points were a basis by which to do apologetics and by which to share the gospel with those that he might meet, especially the Muslims. And yet he was completely unwavering in his commitment. He wrote 60 known theology works that were specifically written as apologetics works in order to convert Muslims to the Christian faith. But despite all of his efforts and eventually the work he did as a missionary, Raymond Llull remained, if you will, a layman his entire life. He never received a formal degree and was never ordained by anyone for the work that he would do. His love for Muslims deepened not only through the gospel, but through his own personal experience. To help him learn the Arabic language, he purchased 2 North African slaves to teach him language full-time. On one occasion, it is said that the slave became so annoyed at Lull's repeated case for Christianity that the two became engaged in a kind of scuffle. The story says that Llull lost his temper and he ended up hitting the slave and found a weapon, the slave who in turn found a weapon and stabbed Raymond Llull in response. Word spread about the incident. The slave was imprisoned for stabbing him, and Llull, who basically didn't get in trouble because it was his slave, Llull went home and became overwhelmed by grief from what he had done and realized that he had completely ruined his witness with this man in the community. And so he made appeals to the man while in prison, asking for his forgiveness and seeking to make amends with him during this time. But Llull was so grieved over what happened that he resolved afresh and anew that this man who was a Muslim from North Africa, that he was going to reach all the Muslims of North Africa, sort of because of the impact this man made on his life. It finally came time for him to leave Spain and head to North Africa, and this is what he wrote in his journal. Quote, I was tolerably rich, I led a secular life. All these things I now cheerfully resign for the sake of promoting the common good and diffusing abroad the holy Christian faith among the Muslims. So he cut all ties, left Spain, and made his way to North Africa. When he landed, Llull quickly discovered that talking about missions among Muslims was a lot easier said than done. Llull found out that this was incredibly difficult work. He recounted that while he was standing on the dock on one occasion, all of his belongings were being brought on board the ship. I'm sorry, I back up for a second. Before he left, he was standing on the dock, and while his belongings were being loaded on the ship, Llull was, quote, overwhelmed with the terror of what would happen. And he began to think of the ideas of possible torture and imprisonment and martyrdom, and it paralyzed him with fear, and he decided that he wasn't cut out for this. And so the ship left with all the stuff, and Raymond Llull went home miserable and dejected because he had disappointed God. But eventually, he came to his senses. He repented for not going and found the next ship going to North Africa. I don't know if he ever got his stuff, but he eventually made his way to North Africa. When he arrived in North Africa, the very first thing that he did was he requested a meeting with the top Islamic scholars in the area to debate Christianity and Islam. And the Muslim scholar, not knowing who he was, reluctantly obliged. When the day came, Llull began to speak passionately about the Christian faith and to talk about Islam, and he was making an appeal for the gospel. One author said that what Llull said that day was, quote, orthodox and evangelical to the core. So in the 1200s, I guess this was the case. But some of the Muslim scholars listened with great interest, but most of them, of course, were deeply offended by his claims of truth and what he was saying. And so as soon as he finished his first debate in North Africa, he was mobbed. A group of men grabbed him, descended upon him, grabbed him in the streets afterward, and hauled him off to prison. And so he was in North Africa for 3 days and found himself already threatened by the death penalty for having preached the gospel as he did. But much to his surprise, he wasn't killed. They took him out back and they tried to stone him, but they weren't successful in stoning him. And so because he survived, they just said, leave and don't come back. And so Llull left the city and decided that he wouldn't go back to that city ever again, but would go elsewhere. But apparently, Raymond Llull, not long after, snuck back into town because he had unfinished business with some of the people that were interested in the message that he had said. I heard a pastor one time say, there's no such thing as a closed country, just a country where it's harder to preach your second sermon. So I guess Raymond Llull lived by that idea. For 3 months, he basically walked around in costume so he wouldn't be recognized, and took a job as a wharf rat, I guess worked on ships is what that means, and was witnessing to the men that he noticed that were interested in the things that he was saying. He saw some fruit in talking with them and a few what seemed to be conversions, but before long people began to put 2 and 2 together and realized that was the guy who had showed up earlier. So he decided to leave and go elsewhere. All right, so let me see here. So he decided to move his work elsewhere. Because of some health issues, Llull eventually returned to Spain for a short time to recover so that he could make his way back. And while there, he continued to study apologetics and continued to grow in his understanding. His return and health took longer than expected, but nevertheless, Raymond Llull decided that he had to return to North Africa, and so he finally made his next journey back at the age of 75 and realized that there was work yet to be done among the North Africans. He wrote, quote, I've discovered that for every Mohammedan that becomes a Christian, 10 Christians become a Mohammedan. And he felt greatly burdened by what he saw, the growing influence of Islam. And so he was determined to do something about it. So he goes to a different area in North Africa for his second debate. And he held a public forum debating the merits of Christianity versus Islam. The decade that had passed made him a little more aware of what to say and what not to say and how to handle himself. And so he began to start by talking about the Ten Commandments, something he knew his audience would understand and respect. He quoted sections from the Quran to show what they believed and where it would overlap with some things in Christianity. But he ultimately was trying to show them the unreliability of Muhammad and some of the things in the Quran, and was quoting their text to them to the point that some of those in the audience didn't think he knew it quite so well. And so, as you can imagine, they didn't appreciate him quoting the Quran back to them in context. So instead, at the end of the debate, Llull was arrested a second time and taken to prison. This time, he wasn't stoned or killed, he was bribed. Chained and shackled into a tiny stone prison for several months, Llull was visited by his Muslim accusers. At first, they tried to convert him, and so they secretly had these conversations, which Raymond Llull welcomed because he had a captive audience there to talk to and continued to witness to them. But when that didn't work, they couldn't convert him to Islam. They decided to entice him with various other temptations. And so they began to offer him riches. They began to bribe him, respectable titles if he would convert and become part of them. They even sent women to his cell to tempt him sexually, which, if you remember, Raymond Llull's past. And Raymond Llull, after seeing all of this, his response to them was simple. He said, I told them, quote, ye have for me women and all sorts of worldly pleasures, which if I accept, ye have for me women and all sorts of worldly pleasures, if I accept the law of Muhammad. I, however, promise you, if ye will forsake your devilish law and accept the Christian faith, God will give you something far better, eternal life. Therefore, I urge you to become Christians. And so Llull was not converted, and they were not converted. Llull was not either, and so he would not recant. But his accusers decided they would do him harm. And so he was basically roughed up, kind of beaten, persecuted, and was kicked out of North Africa for a second time. So he went back home to Spain, right, at the age of 70, whatever it was. So he goes home to think about this, and while in Spain, he realized that Spain was never his home, but that the calling to North Africa was his home. And so Raymond Llull decided that he would go back to North Africa a third time, and went at the age of 82. This time, Llull decided that he was going to do the one thing, since he was 82, the one thing he was not supposed to do, which was to go back to the very first town that told him to never come back. 20 years after they had kicked him out. When he arrived, he found himself in the crowded streets with all the traders. The Muslim devotees were making their way to and from the mosque for the time of prayer. In the midst of it all, this white-haired man from Spain made his way toward the crowded marketplace in the center of town. He had already spent several nights working secretly in the place, and now he was convinced that it was time for his work to come to its final point. As one author put it, Llull had had enough of hiding his Christian light under a Muslim bushel, and it was time for him to speak openly and courageously for Christ. So I'm just going to read this section here. Amid the hustle and bustle of the crowd, Llull stood up in the middle of the marketplace and cried out with the loud blast of a trumpet, shouting, "Christianity is the only true religion, and I can prove it to you by sound reason." He immediately won an audience and began sharing with them the message of the gospel and sharing with them Christ. And several were converted it seems to be converted or were convinced by what they heard. But someone in the crowd, of course, recognized him from some 20 years earlier. And so the word spread that this was the troublemaker from 20 years before. And so the crowd eventually turned on him. He was captured. He was drugged to the edge of the city, and he was thrown into the dust. And Raymond Llull, on the edge of the city, like Stephen from the book of Acts, was there stoned to death. June 30th, 1315, at the age of 83. To Llull, however, this was not a defeat, because according to his journals and his writings, he repeatedly wrote that martyrdom was a victorious end to life and one that he would gladly embrace if God called him to such an end. Raymond Llull is considered to be one of the only known missionaries and apologists during the Middle or Dark Ages in that sense. And yet he gave up everything, a life of luxury, a life of wealth, to go live among those who had never heard, to bring to them the good news of Christ. It was interesting as I was reading about Raymond Llull and thinking about some of the things that he had written, I got to thinking, you know what, this sort of sounds familiar. And so I pulled out a book off my shelf, and some of you will recognize this book. This is by our own Mark Allen. He wrote a book on apologetics, and he has a whole section about Raymond Llull. And I thought, see, Mark copied me. No. He talks about how Raymond Llull's efforts at apologetics were one of acknowledging what in Gentile philosophy, in Muslim thinking that overlapped with Christianity, and how he used that as a bridge by which to be able to share the gospel, and how innovative this was. Because it was usually, they put a sword to your throat and said, convert, and it went both directions, honestly. But this was an effort at reasoned dialogue to try to convert people to the faith. I like how this section ends. He says, even in today's social media-driven world, any argument that amounts to nothing more than "you're stupid and we all know your claim is not true" is generally considered a logical fallacy. But Raymond Llull showed us that the Christian virtues of gentleness, kindness, and compassion were more effective at persuading skeptics of the truthfulness of the gospel than just about anything else.